Well, good evening, folks. How we doing? Spectre here. It is Sunday night now, this 10th day of October, and it definitely feels a little bit unseasonable for this time of year, especially this time of night. We're still in the low 70s at about the 9:30 hour here, and not exactly what you would expect for this deep in the season, but hey, we'll take it, I suppose. Hopefully you guys are doing well. If you're joining here tonight, you can catch me on the YouTube side. I'm over on DLive as well as Twitch, over on the old Tiger Network, and of course over on Vaughn Live here. So I'll wait for some folks to kind of file in here before getting going, but Sunday, hopefully you guys made it to church if you tend to go. And you ever read sometimes your daily devotion and just get kind of a kick to the gut? Today was one of those days. Read the daily walk here and that on my daily devotion here. It says, Lord, how oft shall my brother sin against me, and I forgive him? Until 7 times, Matthew 18:21. Religious teachers of Christ's day taught that 4 times is the extreme limit of forgiveness. Peter exceeded this in his estimate, but how far even he fell short of the divine ideal. 7 was to the Jews the number of perfection, so that no expression could more forcibly convey the impression of ever renewed, eternal repetition than 70 times 7. What comfort there is for each one of us here, for if God expects man to forgive his brother, thus, how may we not count on his forgiveness? And again, just a little bit of a gut check, as it were. Kind of a reminder that, with all the things going on, all the trivialness, the BS that goes on, and the oppression and all the crap, we got to forgive these folks. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, as Ephesians 6 tells us. And we also know that these people know not what they do. We got to remember that these folks are infected, if you will, with spirits that are not of themselves. And so, anyway, that's what I'll lead off with here tonight. And I've got an interesting lineup of things here for the evening. Got a handful of articles I want to cover. So sit back, relax, as always, for the old firesides. If you're a first-time joiner, appreciate you tuning in. And just grab a beverage of choice, whatever that may be, for your typical fireside. Let the old headlines roll in if you wish to kind of watch those come through. Grab a log, grab a bag chair, whatever. Gather around, and we'll get after it. So tonight, first thing I want to cover is an article that came across the old feed here. It's been about a week or so ago, but still rather interesting, called Disinfo versus Democracy. And this was out of Tablet Mag the other day. It says, using accusations of disinformation to suppress scientific criticism, steer media coverage, and silence political opponents is not part of the operating system of a free society. Yeah, one would have to ask themselves, how free do we really think we are at this point? It doesn't seem like we're free, does it? So, the article goes into something like this. Says, First Amendment principles permit the government to punish false speech when it directly and immediately causes specific and serious harm. But unlike defamation, fraud, perjury, and other examples of punishable false speech, the term disinformation or misinformation has no specific legal meaning. Disinformation is widely used to designate false or misleading speech that cannot constitutionally be punished precisely because its potential harms are indirect and speculative, what the U.S. Supreme Court has called an undifferentiated fear or apprehension of negative consequences. So, legalese, right? Should we worry about legalese at this point? Nah, I think we're called to be a little bit bold in our approach. So that's exactly what we'll do. And to be sure, even though the harmful potential of disinformation is more inchoate than that of false speech that is constitutionally punishable, the potential for harm is still real. The many current advocates of restricting disinformation stress that it can cause serious harm, including to individual and public health, and even to democratic self-government itself. Yet, expanding government power to punish such expression would also cause harm that is at least as serious, including to the very same values of health and democratic governance. Now, the negative impact of censoring disinformation comes from its inherent vagueness and subjectivity. The authorities tasked with censorship invariably enforce this malleable concept in ways that reinforce dominant political and societal interest groups and disadvantage minority groups and perspectives. This predictable dynamic is illustrated by a recent experience in a number of other countries, from Russia to South Africa, and also in the United States before the Supreme Court enforced strict limits on punishing false speech. And if you followed me in any of my shows in the past, you know I tend to favor the Constitution just a little bit. First Amendment, things that are protected underneath the First Amendment, the 5 tenets. Having gone through the old Federalist Papers here now a couple years ago, which, by the way, if you ever want to go back and listen to those, it's back on the old archive channels over on YouTube. It says, while the relevant legal analysis focuses on government censorship of disinformation, many of the same concerns also apply to censorship implemented by dominant technology firms. So basically, the Facebooks, the Googles, YouTubes, Twitters, etc. This is although these private sector entities are usually not constrained by the First Amendment, their enormous power and influence over public discourse means that the restrictions on disinformation have adverse consequences similar to government restrictions. So think of that, you know, as we're on a lot of these platforms, and God forbid you're still on any one of those, couple, 2, 3, we should be getting off of those and on to safety to other more free speech platforms, myself included. I'll probably ride the pine and let it ride until they finally kick me off. But until then, make sure, by the way, you get over to the other platforms until we get something else up. But think of that. The entities, they don't care about free speech, but what they do sack you with is their terms and conditions, their end-user license agreements, the ever infamous EULAs, right? And hidden in all that legalese, jargon, and BS are the things that, hey, well, if you put something on our platform that we don't like, well, we reserve the right to take it down. Oh, wait, Section 230 called, right? Moreover, in recent months, mounting evidence suggests that the dominant platform's content restrictions on disinformation and other controversial speech may have been sufficiently induced by a coordinated with government officials that we should seriously consider treating such restrictions as tantamount to government action, and hence subject to First Amendment limits. Let me read that last part again. May have been sufficiently induced by or coordinated with government officials that we should seriously consider treating such restrictions as tantamount to government action and hence subject to First Amendment limits. And immediately, right off the rip as I read that, who do I think of? Dr. Shiva, right? Think of his campaign, and if you've listened to him for any length of time, you know, as he ran for his spot in Congress, we found out that he posted something on Twitter, and of course he's got this all documented, but come to find out that, what is it, Maryland I think he's in, Is that right? I think so. Basically, their government called up Twitter and demanded they take it down. So basically it was the government says, well, we don't like what you got to say. Hey, Twitter. All right, Twitter says, okay, yep, we'll go ahead and do that, and off it went. And he's got that all documented. So the article continues, says, arguments for restricting disinformation consistently focus on the harm that such speech can potentially cause, without analyzing other issues that should be considered before concluding that censorship is justified. First, it is important to underscore the important fact noted above. The harmful potential of disinformation, unlike constitutionally punishable forms of false speech, is indirect and speculative. While the old nursery rhyme is wrong in declaring that words will never hurt me, it is equally untrue that words will always hurt me. The impact of speech on a single human mind, let alone an entire community or society, results from the complex interplay of multiple factors, and hence cannot be confidently predicted or even clearly assessed after the fact. For example, what has been the net impact of disinformation about the 2020 election? Surely, disinformation spurred some negative outcomes, including motivating participants in the event of January 6th. Just as plausibly, though, disinformation about the election spurred some positive outcomes too, including increased efforts to promote healthy skepticism, media literacy, fact-checking, and other measures that would remain necessary even if disinformation were censored. Because we can never completely eliminate the supply of disinformation, the most effective response is to curb the demand for it. Interesting. I'm embarrassed to be caught watching on YouTube now. Yeah, I hear you. Like I said, for a limited time only. That day will come. We've gotten the warnings. We've gotten them on all the channels, and it's just a matter of time. However, if you listen to Cliff High, and perhaps those who haven't, his latest one says we might be rounding a bend here maybe by the end of the month, and we'll have to see. I don't know. So we'll see. But who is the biggest purveyor of disinformation? Well, gee, is it we the people? Or, I might contend, it's probably the government and those who don't like what we got to say on these platforms, right? Why don't we censor them? Well, we can. We can get off their platforms. Get onto free speech platforms. We knew it was going to be a little bit janky and disorganized as things became decentralized, but it's for our own good. So it continues, says, even if we made the purely hypothetical assumption that certain disinformation has a significant negative impact on balance, it still would not follow that government should restrict it. Logically, one could justify restrictions only by analyzing 3 additional questions. 1. Does the restriction materially reduce either the prevalence of such speech or its potential adverse impact? 2. Does a restriction have any adverse consequences, including unintended ones, such as increasing the prevalence or potential adverse impact of the targeted speech, or suppressing other speech that even censorship advocates agree should be protected? And number 3, are there other steps we could pursue to reduce the prevalence of potential adverse impact of the targeted speech that would be at least as effective, but would not entail as many adverse consequences? Sounds like lawyers speak. This additional line of questioning makes common sense. We might well be willing to give up some free speech rights for the sake of advancing some other important goal, such as in the case of disinformation, preserving our democratic form of government. But we shouldn't be willing to forfeit free speech if the sacrifice does not actually have the desired impact, or worse yet, if it actually makes the problem worse, in this case by undermining democracy. Indeed, government punishment of disinformation is fundamentally antithetical to democracy. As the Supreme Court declared in the United States versus Alvarez from 2012, which struck down a federal law criminalizing certain false statements, our constitutional tradition stands against the idea that we need Oceania's Ministry of Truth. Oh, you mean 1984 wasn't meant to be a playbook, you say? As current debates illustrate, one person's cherished truth is another's despised fake news. Speech that critics seek to suppress as disinformation almost never consists of objectively verifiable facts alone, but also involves subjective matters of interpretation and analysis. After all, speakers who intentionally or recklessly utter false statements of fact that directly cause specific harm may constitutionally be punished under existing laws, such as those that ban fraud, defamation, and perjury. In contrast, our legal system scrupulously avoids punishing statements that go beyond straightforward facts and incorporate matters of interpretation or opinion. As the Supreme Court declared in Gertz v. Robert Welch, Inc. from 1974, under the First Amendment, there is no such thing as a false idea. However pernicious an opinion may seem, we depend for its correction not on the conscience of judges and juries, but on the competition of other ideas. While some may bristle at the notion that government is prohibited from silencing false ideas, surely the alternative is far worse. If government were permitted to determine which ideas should be deemed false, and hence punishable, any ideas that depart from prevailing orthodoxy, including those critiquing government policy, would be jeopardized. Such a course could not be more inimical to the most fundamental precepts that undergird our democratic republic. As the Supreme Court eloquently declared in its landmark 1943 decision in West Virginia Board of Education v. Barnett, if there is any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, can prescribe what shall be orthodox in politics, nationalism, religion, or other matters of opinion. Until the Supreme Court reined in the concept of defamation in its groundbreaking 1964 ruling in New York Times v. Sullivan, Southern officials systematically persecuted civil rights leaders and organizations, as well as those national media that covered them, for even slight misstatements of fact. Those officials pursued multiple defamation lawsuits with the specific goal of imposing ruinously large damages judgments in order to stifle both the civil rights activists themselves and the national media that disseminated information about their efforts across the country. Without that national audience and the resulting political and financial support for the civil rights movement, it likely would have foundered. That was precisely the point of the libel lawsuit strategy. In a nutshell, the pre-Sullivan libel laws, which gave government undue discretion to punish disinformation, were unsurprisingly weaponized against the government's critics. We still see that today? To this day, advocates for racial justice, including supporters of the Black Lives Matter movement, have seen their own speech assailed and even suppressed on social media as disinformation. For instance, a May 25, 2021 National Public Radio story quoted Mike Gonzalez, a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation, as stating, "I feel that Black Lives Matter is one of the greatest sources of disinformation. They have manipulated the good nature of many people." The story also quoted Gonzalez, Rudolph Giuliani, and other BLM critics, charging that the movement falsely portrays itself as a racial justice group, whereas its actual goal is to advance a Marxist agenda. While the NPR story quoted critics charging BLM with purveying disinfo, it also quoted BLM leaders who returned the very same charge, complaining that the disinformation accusations themselves constituted disinformation. The unavoidable problems of censoring disinformation have predictably plagued recent laws, including those touted as restricting pandemic-related disinfo in order to protect public health. As The Economist reported in February 2021, censorious governments are abusing fake news laws, invoking the pandemic as, quote, an excuse to gag reporters, end quote, and to silence critics of pandemic-era policies. In February 2020, Amnesty International noted that Singapore's 2019 law against the online falsehoods and manipulation was repeatedly used to target critics and political opponents. The Singaporean government could not deny this, but instead claimed that the law's consistent enforcement against opposition party members was a coincidence. To the contrary, these patterns necessarily result from restrictions on such a vague, broad category of speech, even in democratic regimes. That is why the American Civil Liberties Union brought a 2020 lawsuit challenging disinfo laws that the government of Puerto Rico had recently passed for the asserted purpose of protecting health and safety. One such law makes it a crime to share quote-unquote false information about the government's post-pandemic emergency and curfew orders with the intent to cause confusion, panic, or public hysteria. Shortly after the law went into effect, the Puerto Rican government charged a prominent clergyman with allegedly disseminating false information on WhatsApp about a rumored executive order to close all businesses. In fact, only a short time later, the governor did issue such an order. Even beyond the speech that disinfo laws directly stifle, these laws also suppress incalculable amounts of important expression, including info about the pandemic that could literally be a matter of life or death. That's because the laws deter scientists and other experts from providing info to journalists, and journalists are in turn deterred from conveying info to the public for fear of transgressing or being charged with transgressing the law's blurry boundaries. The ACLU's complaint in the Puerto Rico case was filed on behalf of two prominent investigative journalists who explained that developing stories on matters of immense public concern are often complex, contentious, and murky, and thus inadvertent inaccuracies are inevitable, even in the most thoroughly vetted reporting. So, Snopes? Anybody? Throughout the pandemic, we have witnessed constantly evolving and shifting views among expert individuals and agencies as they steadily gather and analyze additional data. Yesterday's life-endangering disinfo can and has become today's life-protecting gospel. Recall, to cite only the most obvious example, the CDC's changing edicts about mask wearing. Inherently subjective disinfo restrictions can easily be wielded for ulterior purposes, including to promote partisan interests. Consider, for instance, recent evidence that the Biden administration has been pressuring social media companies to restrict content that purportedly purveys disinfo about COVID, in light of allegations that the actual concerns may well involve politics at least as much as public health. Republican members of Congress have claimed that platforms have restricted conservative posts on issues related to the pandemic in response to pressure from administration officials, even though the posts contained no factual misrepresentations and simply conveyed perspectives with which the administration disagreed. Whether or not these claims are factually correct, it is true that the concept of disinformation is so open-ended that it could be deployed against particular communications for partisan reasons. No, they would never do that, would they? The inevitable manipulatability of restrictions on disinformation is well illustrated by YouTube's recent removal of a video for violating its medical misinformation policy, which, by the way, yours truly has had, one or two taken down for that effect. The video, which had been posted by New York Rep. Nicole Malliotakis, was of an August 2021 news conference in which she announced a lawsuit challenging New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio's vaccine passport as an invasion of privacy and an unreasonable mandate on small businesses. Although Malliotakis supports vaccination, she believes that the mandate constitutes government overreach, a position that the Supreme Court might well end up sharing. After Malliotakis appealed YouTube's removal, the company said it was taking another look and ultimately reinstated the video, thus underscoring the inherent elasticity of the misinformation concept. Whether or not YouTube actually had a good faith health reason for its initial removal of the video, the fact remains that the vague policy can easily be invoked as a pretext, masking other motives. All the more reason, then, to be suspicious of even sincere attempts by public and private authorities to prevent the harm that disinformation can cause. Recall that Southern officials based their libel lawsuits against activists and journalists during the civil rights movement on the dissemination of inaccurate information. What we learned in that era is that disinformation is unavoidable in any vigorous discussion of fast-breaking public issues, and that making it punishable by law can only inhibit democratic debate. It's time we relearn that lesson. Pretty good article. And so, like I said, as it pertains to YouTube, my guess is that a lot of that stuff is auto-triggered by their algos. My guess is that there's probably very little human intervention. You got some data scientist behind the scenes who writes up some crazy algo based on some word terms, what have you. And lickety-split, away you go. Well, get Joe Blow from Congress who doesn't like what you got to say, and, we'll just change that to include, here's 50 more words. And so that'll ensnare a few more channels and shows that out there. And again, they get away with it because of their end-user license agreements that we all agree to, right? So anyway, more to that to come, I'm sure. Alright, aside from that, another interesting piece graced the old feed here today. The rise of weak men is killing American innovation and prosperity. Piece out of American Thinker here today. Starts off with, by the way, how many of you guys watched Trump's rally last night in Des Moines? You guys catch that by chance? Think it was par for the course, humdrum, more of the same, more, what do you think? Yeah, good to see you, Deborah W. Backfa in the house, good to see you. Dogs at play. Teens, pretty pups, good to see you. Alright, well anyway, Donald Trump failed at business. A lot. USFL, Tour de Trump, Trump Resorts, Trump Airlines, Trump University, etc. Leftists love to point that out, but that's not the whole story. Trump had great successes as well. Not only has he developed world-class properties around the globe, but he was also produced and starred in one of the most popular television shows for more than a decade. Most telling of all was his renovations of the Woolman ice rink. New York City had spent $13 million in 6 years trying to renovate the Central Park icon when, in 1986, New York City admitted it had failed and must start from scratch. Trump offered to do the job in 6 months and under the $3 million budget. Reluctantly, the city gave him the contract, and he finished in 4 months at a cost of $2.25 million. In just 4 months, Donald Trump demonstrated exactly how dysfunctional government is. And how many times did we see that even for the 4 years we did have DJT in-house? Think back to Boeing and reworking of the contracts for Air Force One, right? But it's his failures that provide the life lesson that leftists never get. Whether in business, love, or most non-government related things, failure is a sign that someone was willing to risk the consequences to try and accomplish something. I say non-government related because government is one of the few areas of life where failure is the rule rather than the exception, and it rarely results in soul-searching. Proof abounds. From a failed 50-year war on poverty to the abject failure of government schools to 20-year wars that end exactly where they started, government continues to grow and accumulate more power year after year, regardless of its demonstrable and perpetual lack of success. But government is not the nation. Government is not the people. Government is supposed to be a mechanism by which citizens protect individual rights and defend the nation. But that's not what it is today. Today, it's everywhere, all the time. There is nothing in our lives that is more ubiquitous than government regulation. In 1958, Leonard Read wrote an essay called I Pencil that looked at the countless elements and activities necessary to make a number 2 pencil. The whole point of this Cold War era piece was to demonstrate how complex it is to make a simple pencil, how society benefits from freeing up markets to provide all the necessary inputs, and how its unlikely government control could accomplish that task. It's extraordinary, and it's just a simple pencil. Now, exponentially expand that complex process for a pencil to our modern society, and you understand what the challenge is. On the one hand, you look at the iPhone, or Google, or Tesla, and you might conclude we're doing pretty well with government regulating as much as it does. Actually, that's a mirage. While a Tesla may be a step up from a '55 Ford, it's still just a car. While carrying your iPhone in your hand is a leap from being tethered to a wall phone, it's still just a mobile phone and a personal computer, both invented in the early 70s, years after the internet began. Over the last 50 years, things have gotten smaller, faster, and portable. But we haven't cured cancer. We don't have teleportation or time travel, as far as we know, and we haven't been back to the moon or beyond. We have lots of apps and services, but not much truly revolutionary. Compare that to the 50 years from 1850 to 1900, when Americans invented such revolutionary things as the light bulb, the safety elevator, the telephone, the phonograph, the vacuum cleaner, and the dishwasher. Or between 1900 and 1950, when they invented air conditioning, plastic, vulcanized rubber, television, talking movies, the photocopier, and the transistor. Not to mention airplanes, helicopters, and nuclear power. While technology is most certainly unleashing heretofore impossible advances in research, medicine, and data analysis, the MRI machine, sequence of human genome, etc., the relative lack of tangible revolutionary advances is extraordinary. And why is that? Are we at the end of science? Have we accomplished everything that man can do? Obviously not. It's almost as if there's something holding America back. There is. It's called regulation. Federal regulation from a seemingly endless array of agencies, the IRS, the EPA, OSHA, DOE, DOT, etc. The Competitive Enterprise Institute estimates that federal regulation alone costs the U.S. almost $2 trillion per year in lost productivity. That's essentially 10% of our GDP annually. Over the 50 years between 1921 and 1970, the American GDP grew at an average annual rate of 4.02%, while between 1971 to 2020, it grew at an annual rate of 2.73%, dropping down to 1.77% for the last 20 years. The result of that slowdown has been staggering. In 2020, after growing at a rate of 2.73% a year for 50 years, the American GDP was approximately $21 trillion. Had it instead grown at the same rate it had the previous 50 years, the 2020 GDP would have been almost twice as high, to $39 trillion. Imagine the research and development a whole additional U.S. GDP could fund. 18 trillion, or, put another way, every American household would have had another $50,000 to spend annually. But households don't. And it's directly related to regulation. The Code of Federal Regulations contains every law and rule of the federal government. In 1938, it was 18,193 pages. After dropping down to 9,745 pages in 1950, it shot up to 56,720 pages in 1972. And by 2019, it stood at 185,984 pages. On every one of those pages are rules that govern Americans' lives. From what goes into their food, to the employment conditions of every person who manufactured or transported or sold every single product they buy. From reporting rules for companies to bank deposit info to what's printed on the side of a can of corn or a box of cereal. Then there's who you can or must rent your home to, how much energy your computer monitor uses, what you pay for gas, and now what you have to put into your body. That is the world the swamp dwellers have built. The one Donald Trump fearlessly leaped into a cauldron of fire to fight. Sadly, far too many Americans are either part of that system or comfortable with the illusion of security it provides. This exemplifies G. Michael Hoff's statement that hard times create strong men. Strong men create good times. Good times create weak men. And weak men create hard times. Those who oppose Donald Trump's attempt to save America from itself are those weak men. Like the European nations that grew soft under the security umbrella the United States provided, those weak men flourished and took over media, academia, Wall Street, and high-tech, even as working America was focused on building on the promise of opportunity. Weak men's control of culture has undermined the nation that allowed them to flourish in the first place. However, as Joe Biden delivers the omnipresent government they desire, reality will shatter the illusion of security they hid behind, while strong men's failures and successes were building Pax Americana. Think of that. How many weak men we see in high places today. I think we have a name for some of those. Something along the lines of a beta cuck, perhaps. I think of people like, some folks in the FBI, perhaps, when they couldn't not get Trump elected, so they had to concoct a plan, right? Something along those lines. So yes, we are probably on the downhill side of that curve, right? Good times create weak men. Now we're going to have to endure some hard times that are going to have to create some strong men to pull us out of it. Some alpha males. Alright. Aside from that, kind of along the lines of the hard times, this kind of feeds right into that. 15 common dynamics of SHTF collapses. So, people always say, how do you think it's going to play out, when the old SHTF happens? Financially, they say quickly and then all at once. So you'll see it start and then boom, the bottom is going to completely drop out. But is that really the case? Well, this article is going to delve into that. Out of the Organic Prepper blog. It says, when it comes to how we see and prepare for shit hitting the fan, think in terms of real and probable rather than fictional and possible can make a big difference. Even though SHTF has many forms and levels, and is in essence complex, random, diverse, and unsystematic, some patterns and principles are common to the way things unfold when it hits the fan. With Toby and Selko's 7 Pillars of Urban Preparedness as inspiration, I came up with a different list of the 15 dynamics and realities of collapses. So number 1, SHTF is nuanced and happens in stages. Thinking about SHTF as an on and off switch, all or nothing endgame, is a common mistake that can lead to severe misjudgments and failures in critical areas of preparedness. Part or parts of the system crash, freeze, fail, or become impaired. This is how SHTF happens in the real world, and when it does, people run for safety first. In effect, resort to more familiar behaviors, expecting things to go back to normal soon. By normal behaviors, I mean everything from hoarding stuff, toilet paper in the last year, anybody? To rioting, looting, and crime, and yes, using cash, as these happen all the time, even when things are normal. But no one becomes a barterer or peddler or pernicious metal specialist in a week. Society adapts as time passes and the situation requires. That's why preppers who are also SHTF survivors, and thus talk from personal experience, insist that abandoning fantasies and caring for basics first is crucial. This is not a coincidence. It is how things happen in the real world. Recently I wrote about black markets and the role of cash in SHTFs, emphasizing these things take precedence except in a full-blown apocalypse, which no one can say if, when, or how will happen, because it never has. Well, now I don't pretend to be the owner of the truth, but those insisting changes in society happen radically or abruptly should check this article about the fallout in Myanmar. Yeah, how much have we heard since Myanmar overthrew their government in coup form at the beginning part of the year? Anybody keeping tabs on that? I certainly haven't. Maybe I'll pull some articles for maybe a Wednesday show. We'll have to see. So number 2, everything crawls until everything runs. Number 2 is a corollary to number 1. SHTF happens in stair steps, but most people failing to prepare and getting caught off guard is evidence of the difficulty of the human brain to fully grasp the concept of exponential growth. It bears telling the analogy of the stadium being filled with water drops to illustrate this. Let's say we add one drop into a watertight baseball stadium. The deposited volume doubles every minute. In effect, 1 minute later, we add 2 more drops, then 4 in the next minute, 8 in the next, then 16, and so on. How long would it take to fill the entire stadium? Sitting at the top row, we'd watch for 45 minutes as the water covered the field. Then, at the 48-minute mark, 50% of the stadium would be filled. Yes, that's only 3 minutes from practically empty to half full. At this point, we have just 60 seconds to get out. The water will be spilling before the clock hits 49 minutes. This is an important dynamic to understand and keep in mind because it applies to most things. Another example, it took over 2 million years of human prehistory and history for the world's population to reach a billion, and less than 250 years more to grow to almost 8 billion. So some things to keep in mind, right? Kind of grows asymptotically. Number 3, the system doesn't vanish or change suddenly. Based on history, the Mad Max-like scenario some so feverishly advocate is not in our near future. The Roman Empire unraveled over 50 years. We may not be at the tipping point of our collapse or the last minute of the flooding stadium, as illustrated in number 2 above. But time is relative, and those 60 seconds can last 5, 10, 15 years. Things are accelerating, but there's no way to tell at which point in the curve we are. That doesn't mean things will be normal in that period. A lot has happened to people and places all over the Roman Empire during those 5+ centuries. Wars, plagues, invasions, droughts, shortages, all hell broke loose. Our civilization has already hit the iceberg, and the current order is crumbling. There will be shocks along the way, some small and some big, but SHTF is a process, not an event. And, of course, if you follow what I've been putting out there the last several weeks, the morning shows, long streams, I've certainly been focused on the dynamics of energy and our supply chains. I mean, you can see it practically real time play out, day by day. Number 4, history repeats, but always with a twist. That's because nature works in cycles, and humans react to scarcity and abundance predictably, and in the same ways. Also, we're helpless in the face of the most significant and recurring events. But things are never the same. Technology improves, social rules change, humankind advances, the population grows. This, and lots more, adds a variability factor to the magnitude, gravity, and reach of outcomes. What better proof than the COVID-19 pandemic just surpassing the 1918 Spanish flu death toll in the US? It'll probably do so everywhere else too, even if we don't believe the official data. Then, or now, we're not yet out of this new coronavirus situation. Number 5. SHTF is about scarcity. A shrink in resources invariably leads to changes in the individual standard of living or entire society. Depending on the circumstances, depth, and reach of the disaster or collapse, then it starts affecting life itself. In effect, people dying. Essentially, when things really hit the fan, abundance vanishes, and pretty much everything reverts to the mean. Food becomes replenishment. Drinking becomes hydration. Sleeping becomes rest. Home becomes shelter, and so on. Surviving is accepting and adapting to that. Number 6. The consequences matter more than the type of event. I'll admit to being guilty of debating probable causes of SHTF more often than I should, mainly when it comes to the economy and finance going bust. That's from living in a third world country with all the crap that comes with it. That's what I have to talk, warn, and give advice about. I still find it essential to be aware and thoughtful of the causes, but it's for the consequences that we must prepare for. Instability, corruption, bureaucracy, criminality, inflation, social unrest, divisiveness, wars, and all sorts of conflicts and disruptions that affect us directly. Number 7. Life goes on. Humankind advances through hardships, but thrives in routine. We crave normalcy and peace, and over the long term pursue them. Contrary to what many think, life goes on even during SHTF, and things tend to return to normal after the immediate threats cease or get contained. At least some level of normal, considering the circumstances. For example, in occupied France, the bistros and cafes continued serving and entertaining the population, and even the invaders, the Nazi army. It was hard, as is always the case anywhere there is war, poverty, tyranny, but that doesn't mean the world has ended. Number 8. SHTF pileup. Disasters and collapses add instability, volatility, and fragility to the system, which can compound and cause further disruptions. Sometimes unfavorable cycles on various fronts, nature and civilization, can also converge and generate a perfect storm. It's crucial to consider that and try to prepare as best we can for multiple disasters happening at once or in sequence on various levels, collective and individual, even if psychologically and mentally. And if the signs are any indication, we're entering such a period of simultaneous changes and challenges. Number 9, the snowball effect. Now, Daisy based her excellent article on the 10 most likely ways to die when SHTF on the principle of large-scale die-off caused by a major disaster, like an EMP or other. This theory is controversial and the object of endless discussions. Some say it's an exaggeration, but in my opinion, that's leaving a critical factor out of the equation. Consider the following. According to WPR and the CDC, before COVID-19, the mortality rate in the U.S. was well below 1%. That's about 2,850,000 per year, or about 8,100 per day. If the mortality rate increases to just 5%, this alone would spark other SHTFs, potentially more serious and harmful than the first. That five-fold jump in mortality would result in more than 16 million dead per year, or 44,000 per day. That's 5% we're talking about, not 20 or 30. If there's even a protocol to deal with something like that, I'm not aware. It would be catastrophic on many levels over a shorter period, say a few months. Early in the CV-19 pandemic, some cities had trouble burying the dead, and the death rate was still below 1%. Sure, other factors were playing, but the point is, things can snowball. Consequences and implications are too complex, not potentially far-reaching. Think about the effects on the system. I think about that quite a bit, actually, in terms of the supply chain disruptions, things of that nature. We have no idea what the real figures are out of any state, how many truly truckers were down, how many people are affected by COVID, sick, laid up, died off, what have you. I mean, globally we're so interconnected at this point. If there's one slight kink in the chain or break in the chain, it throws the whole thing kittywampus, right? So number 10, SHTF is a situation, but it's also a place. Things are hitting the fan somewhere right now. Not any overblowing media, but the physical world. The Texas border, third world prisons, gang-ruled Haiti, and Taliban-raided Afghanistan, and the crack house just a few blocks from an affluent neighborhood, under the bridges of many big cities worldwide, in volcano-hit islands. There are thousands of places where people are bugging out, suffering, or dying of all causes at this very moment. If you're not in any SHTF, consider yourself lucky. Be grateful, too. Being able to prepare is a luxury. Number 11, choosing one way or another has a price. Being unprepared and wrong has a price. However, so does being prepared and wrong. Though some benefits exist regardless of what happens, the investment in terms of time, finance, and emotion to be prepared could be applied elsewhere or used for other finalities, career, a business, relationships, etc., rather than some far-out collapse. Since so much in SHTF is unknown and open, and resources are limited even when things are normal, survival and preparedness are essentially trade-offs. We must read the signals, weigh the options, consider the probabilities, make an option, and face the consequences. That's why striving for balance is so important. Number 12. SHTF is dirty, smelly, ugly. This is undoubtedly one of the most striking characteristics of SHTF. How bad some places and situations can be. Most people have no idea, and they don't want to know about this. Those who fantasize about being in SHTF should think twice. Abject misery and despair have a distinct smell of excrement, sewage, death, rotting material, pollution, trash, burned stuff, and all kinds of dirt imaginable. And insects. The movies don't show these things, but bad smells and insects infest everything and everywhere, and it can be maddening. During my street survival training, I get to visit some really awful places and witness horrible things. The folks eventually going out with me invariably get shocked, sometimes even sickened, when they see decadence up and close for the first time. Even ones used to dealing with the nasties, it's hard not to get affected. For instance, drug consumption hotspots are so smelly and nasty that someone really must have to be on crack just to stand being there. It's hell on earth, and I can't think of another way to describe these and other places, like third world prisons, trash deposits, and many others. Early on, being in these places would make me question why I do this. It never becomes normal. We just adapt. But seeing these realities changes our life and the way we see things. Number 13. The grid is fragile. It's baffling how this escapes so many. Most people I know are in constant marvel with modern civilization. They look around, pointing and saying, "Are you crazy? Too big to fail? There's no way this can go away. Nothing has ever happened. We have someone to take our trash, slaughter, process our food, treat our sick, purify our water, treat our sewage, protect us from wrongdoers and evil people, and keep them locked, control the traffic, and defend our rights." Peeking behind the curtains is a red pill moment. What keeps the grid up and running is not something small, but it's fragile. The natural state of things is not an insipid, artificially controlled environment. On the positive side, it makes us feel more grateful, humble, and also more responsible. Number 14. The frog in the boiling water. That's you and me and everyone around us. There's no other way around it. We're the suckers who get squeezed and pay the bill whenever something happens, anywhere and everywhere. It's always our freedoms, rights, money, and privacy that gets attacked, threatened, and stolen. Not only because the 1% screws us at the top, but because we're the big numbers, the masses. and only those who work and produce something can bear the brunt of whatever bad happens to society and civilization. Make no mistake, whenever the brown stuff hits the fan, it will fall on us. It's no reason to revolt, but to acknowledge that, ultimately, we're responsible for ourselves. And number 15. People can make things worse. Just have a look around and see what's happening. Selko himself will tell you that the most dangerous thing about the SHTF is other people. So in conclusion, sometimes the mechanics, brutality, and harshness of SHTF end up in the background of personal narratives and emotional accounts. Being more knowledgeable and cognizant of some general aspects of collapses may allow flexibility, creativity, improvisation, adaptation, resiliency, and other broad and effective strategies. Or simply provide material for reflection and debate. Really. Either way, even those who haven't been through collapse can still learn from history, from others' experiences, from human behavior, from the facts. Just be sure to see the world for what it is, and not from what you think, because it will go its own way, and reality will assert itself all the same. What are your thoughts about the dynamics of an SHTF scenario? Are there any you would want to add? Does this match up with your personal expectations? Let's discuss in the comments. That was Fabian Omar from the Ultimate Survival Gear Handbook and Street Survivalism. So a pretty good read and perspective, perhaps, from somebody who probably has lived this. And I would say anybody that probably lives in Cuba, Venezuela, or any third world country probably is well aware of these things. You know, a lot of the things that we take for granted, they don't have. Count your blessings every day for the fact you got a roof over your head, clothes on your back, food to eat, and a vehicle to get you from point A to B. That's about it. Everything else, that's affluence, right? Alright, well, I'm going to change things up a bit here. I am actually going to play a pre-recorded version of an article I did here. Hopefully you'll enjoy it. So I am going to cut this guy loose and we'll discuss. This is a letter to a COVIDian, a time travel experiment, via Margaret Anna Ellis through the Looking Glass Substack. The criminalization of physical presence and the power of a hug. Hello there. I understand you're a believer. You have zealous, unwavering faith in the system. You trust the science. You deem anything that falls beyond the margins of the approved narrative misinformation, conspiracy theories, and fake news. You dutifully wear your badge of obedience. You social distance. You lock down when you're told to lock down. You report others for violating these and any other applicable dictates. You were first in line to get injected. You were first in line to get re-injected. You cried tears of joy both times. You cannot wait to get your booster injection. You have not bothered to conduct independent research outside the authorized avenues of deception. Read peer-reviewed scientific literature, not funded by the pharmaceutical drug cartel, or critically evaluate the press releases being parroted by your trusted leaders, experts, and media mouthpieces. You demand that everyone who is a non-believer either comply with the decrees of your faith or be excluded from public activities, deprived of employment, denied access to health care, stripped of the right to protest, bullied into submission, and quarantined. You find these heretics disgusting, despicable spreaders of disease who are a threat to the public health. You wouldn't be against removing them from your community, maybe concentrating them in a special holding center until they get injected. Anyway, you feel no pity if they die. It is their own fault, after all. Maybe you're not that bad, yet. Give it a few more weeks. The propagandists will bring you around. Look how far you've come already. Look how many of your rights you voluntarily relinquished. How many values you've dumped along the way in the name of safety, in the name of security, in the name of health, in the name of the public good. You felt it was worth it, and you don't regret it. You only wish others wouldn't keep crying about my freedoms, my body, my choice, and other stupid, antiquated ideas. Don't they realize how selfish they're being? What a hazard they are to their fellow citizens? This is an emergency, an unprecedented, incalculable, catastrophic, worldwide crisis. And we will never, ever get back to normal if they keep stubbornly insisting on preserving their liberties. Right? I wish I could talk to yourself from 2 years ago. If that self had been told the entire world could be brought to a halt, and our freedom suspended at the whim of its leaders for a phenomenon humans had been living with and adapting to in countless variations for millennia, you would think I was describing a dystopian fiction. I might still be able to reason with that self. Instead, this is a likely futile exercise in trying to awaken a hostage suffering from Stockholm Syndrome to the fiendish machinations of her captor. Think back to a couple of years ago, summer 2019, let's say. What were you doing then? What was your life like? How did you feel about your past, present, and future? What did you care about? How did you spend your time? What were your core values? What would you think about how you think, feel, and behave today? That's the person I want to talk to, not your present self. I'm sure your 2019 self would be fascinated to hear what your current self has to say. Although I'd be willing to bet a few thousand inflationary dollars she wouldn't recognize what you've become. And I'm not speaking about you, personally. You're probably a nice person who is doing what she thinks is best. I understand where you're coming from. I understand why so many well-meaning people feel the same as you. I'm speaking to everyone who persists in uncritically accepting the rationales being given for remaking our world into an open-air prison. I'm speaking to everyone who is sleepwalking into their own enslavement without a second thought, without even the willingness to examine the situation from a perspective outside the one they've been programmed to believe. Had we not been subjected to a global case of Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, orchestrated by experts in mass control like the Behavioral Insights Team, unabashedly described as the Nudge Unit at the UK government's website, and implemented across the MSM and social media, you would be still living and loving life the same way you were 2 years ago. All of us would be. But then we wouldn't have willingly forfeited our rights, one by one, out of terror. We wouldn't have started perceiving our fellow human beings as bioweapons to be shamed, ostracized, and eliminated. Medical segregation further divides an already fragmented populace, making us ever easier to control. The psychological trauma of this isolation and splintering is incalculable, and the full extent of the damage will likely not be comprehended for decades. In this video, Dr. Rainer Fulmick addresses the audience at a London protest. For more details on the heroic work of Dr. Fulmick and the Berlin Corona Investigative Committee, see the Recommendations Roundup. Toward the end, at the 9:02 mark, he relays a story a German doctor, shared with his team. He wanted to withdraw money at an ATM and went to the lobby of a bank for that purpose. There stood an elderly woman wearing a mask who fearfully backed away from him because he was not wearing a mask. She said he had to wear a mask because otherwise she was afraid of infecting herself and then her husband. The doctor told her no, she shouldn't be afraid. And then he went up to her, took off her mask, and took her in his arms. The woman began to cry and said that no one had hugged her for more than a year. Don't you think that's heartbreaking? At another protest, an elderly woman in a wheelchair held up a sign reading, "I'd rather die from COVID than loneliness," a sentiment echoed by millions in nursing homes around the world. What right have you to make that decision for her, for them, for any of us, for that matter? Go back to yourself from 2 years ago and see what she thinks about acts like hugging, smiling, kissing, and singing being criminalized. Contagious diseases existed then, too, but we haven't yet been conditioned to fear one another's physical presence. Dehumanization is far more effective when we cannot see each other's faces, touch each other's hands, speak in person, or embrace. And now, Australia's New South Wales Chief Health Officer Kerry Chant is telling people, don't start up a conversation.
We have to stop the spread of COVID. To do this, we all need to work together. We need to limit our movements. We need to consider whenever we leave our house that anyone with us, anyone we come into contact with, could convey the virus. So, whilst it is in human nature to engage in conversation with others, to be friendly, unfortunately, this is not the time to do that. So even if you run into your next door neighbour in the shopping centre, in the Coles, whilst you're at Coles or Woolworths or Aldi or any other grocery shop, don't start up a conversation. Now is the time for minimising your interactions with others. Even if you've got a mask, do not think that affords total protection. We want to be absolutely sure that as we go about our daily lives, we do not come into contact with anyone else that would pose a risk. Obviously, there are essential work. There is work, and I shouldn't use that term essential. I understand that work is essential to everyone, and probably need a new word other than essential. But I think the community understands what we mean. We need to maintain our food services, logistics supply. We need hospitals and health services to be operating. But now is the time to really ensure that everyone complies with the spirit and intent. And the spirit and intent of the public health orders is to reduce mobility, reduce the opportunities for anyone to come into contact with anyone else. And so that responsibility is now firmly on workplaces to take those actions. And clearly we have seen the closure of a number of workplaces which facilitates that as well. And finally, another action I want to make it clear is permitted under these lockdown provisions is going out and getting a vaccine. You shouldn't go if you're a close contact or you've been designated as a casual contact, but please go and get vaccinated. There is access to vaccines, and the vaccines are incredibly effective at preventing hospitalisation and death, and they are the way out. And yes, we haven't got enough vaccine at the moment, but we have got some vaccine which is accessible, and I would urge everyone to go forward for your second dose of AstraZeneca, or also your first dose, or if you're eligible for Pfizer, to take up that opportunity. Thank you.
What are they afraid of, us telling one another? When people no longer speak in person, all communications can be mediated through big tech, which will decide what they feel is safe for you to hear. Every aspect of the regulations being unleashed globally is designed to separate us, creating an apartheid system that outlaws dissent and encourages the persecution of those who question the state. Please remember the humanity of those you're being progressively conditioned to revile, to the point you become okay with them being fined, excluded from access to necessities, arrested, and held in captivity. It's happening elsewhere. Don't delude yourself into thinking it can't happen here, wherever here may be for you. I extend across this virtual space a hug to you. I will leave you with this music video by Ing and the Triton Kings, a nonagenarian Holocaust survivor performing with her heavy metal band. Ing Ginsberg shares a message we desperately need to hear today. I hope you will listen.
The heavy metal was because I can't sing. If I could sing, carry a tune, they would have made totally different music. An old woman who sings heavy metal is unique. The universe echoes back.
This courageous woman, who had survived unspeakable hardships in her 99 years, succumbed, in the end, to solitary confinement. According to her New York Times obituary, by the spring of 2020, she was living in the Zurich care facility when she contracted the coronavirus. Pandemic restrictions often kept residents from seeing one another or from entertaining visitors, and the isolation took its toll. We have no doubt whatsoever that she died because of boredom, loneliness, and depression, Mr. Da Silva said. He and Ms. Caruso kept in touch with her over the phone, and the three began writing another song for the band called Never Again, also drawing on Ms. Ginsburg's experience during the Holocaust. Each one of my songs has a message, Ms. Ginsburg said in the documentary. Don't destroy what you can't replace. She added a second message. You can't avoid death, so laugh about it. Praying for yourself, for all of humanity. Please heed her message. If you sow hatred, the universe echoes back. Radiate love. The universe echoes back. Well, there you go. That was a little bit different. What do you think of some heavy metal in the middle of a fireside? You gotta enjoy the article, I suppose, to see this little old lady. She is just having the time of her life if you watch the video. It is rather humorous to watch, but I'll give her credit. And those are some mean violins, by the way. Can't say I've listened to heavy metal with some electric violins that aggressively before. So that may be a first, maybe a last, who knows? On a fireside, we'll have to see here. But I got one more here on the evening, and then I'll let you guys do as you see fit. Another one out of American Thinker says, we can govern ourselves. Tens of millions of us were brought up in America to view rightly Marxist socialism as an evil ideology that must be destroyed. Part of our personal understanding of what it means to be American was forged in our understanding of what it means not to be American. In America, until recently, freedom of speech was guaranteed. In most other nations of the world, that was not true. In America, until recently, the freedom to practice one's religious faith without government interference was guaranteed. In most other nations of the world, that freedom was not protected. In America, until recently, personal liberty was maximized to the greatest extent possible, and authorities were forbidden from infringing on that liberty by a constitution specifically designed to minimize government power. In most other nations of the world, government power has always been maximized and individual power dismissed. These are rock-solid principles that do not countenance expedient exceptions. They are not true one day, sort of true the next, and then discarded the day after that. The right to own firearms in order to preserve life and constrain the growth of a tyrannical government does not disappear because Congress or the Supreme Court or the President wakes up one morning and decides that modern government is sufficient to protect the people from crime and is capable of determining for itself what is and is not tyrannical. The right to engage freely with others and chart one's own course through life without stifling interference from school boards, regulatory agencies, or tax authorities does not vanish because a new generation of petty totalitarians decide that they must control each American's life from womb to tomb. The right to personal freedom lives regardless of whether government actors decide to stamp it out of existence. It exists in perpetuity, beyond the artificial laws created by man. Dissolving it by government decree is as absurd as decreeing that henceforth there shall be no sun or stars. No matter how hard they endeavor, rule makers cannot destroy what they did not create. If a stranger came up to you and said, "Here, put this in your mouth," would you just kindly oblige? If a used car salesman approached you with a syringe and said, "Hold out your arm for me," would you feel compelled to do so? Then why in the world should a rational human being in control of his own future be expected to do so for pharmaceutical reps whose job it is to sell drugs, government agencies who have given those reps absolute legal immunity, and healthcare bureaucrats who represent the interests of foreign powers? Why should any individual's agency be sacrificed so that the government's agency alone prevails? Why should free people accept that they are not capable of thinking for themselves? We have long known that the political left promotes its hideous socialism by just adding the word justice to any issue. At a time when the FBI is intimidating parents for exercising their free speech at school board meetings, political prisoners protesting for fair elections have been abused by their government, and medical terrorists are threatening Americans to shoot up with an experimental serum or lose their jobs and livelihoods, we are in desperate need of good old-fashioned justice in its authentic form to return. Just because sellouts in government, business, or the military decide to throw freedom aside to betray America's founding ideals doesn't mean principled Americans should suicidally follow those with no principle at all toward the cliff's edge. Drink the Kool-Aid, they said. Just like Jim Jones, eh? Unlike the un-American Dr. Fauci, who actually believes that individual rights must be abandoned for the greater good of society, free Americans will never make excuses for replacing liberty with servitude. Unlike Joint Chiefs Chairman General Mark Milley, who proved how quickly he would fold in the face of peril and embrace Marxism for personal gain, red-blooded Americans will never stop treating authoritarianism as our enemy, even if the White House and Congress were to finally stand up and declare what we already suspect, that the U.S. government is up to its neck in the very evil we Americans were born to fight. No American should trade freedom for this modern fusion of communism and fascism, just because too many men and women in positions of power allow themselves to be corrupted and beaten by our sworn enemies. If fighting totalitarianism means one day fighting Washington, then so be it. Better to stand strong behind America's founding truths than that ushered in greater liberty and prosperity around the world, even if doing so puts our futures at risk, than to cower in darkness, left crippled by the chains of socialism's eternal slavery to the state. Life without freedom is not life at all. At its heart, the fight for freedom is the fight for common sense over constant lies. Almost everything advanced as truth today is built on falsehood. Man's use of hydrocarbon energy is not leading us to extinction, as government-paid quote-unquote experts insist. The China virus is not the death sentence we've been instructed to fear by politicians who wish to remake the world into something more easily controlled. Xenophobia and misogyny have never been so trifling in America, even though the nightly news and the FBI falsely insist otherwise. And as the world now knows, the whole Russia collusion scam was an Obama-Clinton gambit all along. Because most politicians don't honestly believe in God, they think man's resounding belief in a higher power is proof that human beings are easily manipulated. And even worse, proof that humanity should be manipulated for their purposes. This is why they have no problem telling such blatant lies about our imminent extinction from global warming or COVID-19 84 when it serves to redistribute power from those with too little to those with too much. Americans with common sense understand that government has abandoned truth entirely. And if you don't yet realize you're being flooded with falsehoods and conditioned to think of yourself as an inferior human being deserving of second-class rights, then those spreading these falsehoods and doing the conditioning thank you for your continued subservience. There are those who see when they are shown, and those who refuse to see what's before them. In its war on freedom, the government hopes we all remain in the latter prison. There still exists in the world today a veritable axis of evil. It's just that the axis set up camp here at home. Elites with titles and prestigious government positions tell lies to other elites in news conglomerates, who then retell those lies to global audiences, either because they are too dumb to know better, useful idiots, or more than happy to become another member of the conspiracy committing fraud against the public. Either way, almost everything an elite says is false, with all the truth screamed out by common folk are trivialized as ignorant falsehoods. Politicians, the Department of Justice, and the intelligence community produce lies for a living. The media companies launder those lies and turn them into truths for mass dissemination. And the tech monopolies seek out and destroy anybody who objects. This is the crystalline prison that has descended all around us today, more seductive than Stalin's Iron Curtain, and therefore more evil in its effect. 19th century French composer Hector Berlioz once noted ironically, "Time is a great teacher that eventually kills all of its students." There has never been a worse teacher in America than the American government is today, but it does seem committed to reaching the same result. Perhaps it is time that Americans realize we can choose to begin governing ourselves. We merely have to decide we've had enough. Tough words, but absolutely true. And essentially it starts with you. Where is your red line in the sand, right? When will you have enough? What will it encompass? Losing your job, putting a mask on, take a jab, what? If not now, when? Oh, fire's making you sleepy? Well, that's kind of the intent. Suppose it'll put you to sleep here this evening. Alright, so that is what I had planned for the evening. If you guys have anything else you would wish to discuss, you guys can throw that out there. Spend maybe a couple minutes here. How long have I run here? 11 o'clock, start about 9:30. Yeah, maybe about 10 minutes if we got that much. Line was crossed long ago. Whoops. Little late start. Sunday night. How many of you guys got Columbus Day off tomorrow? Any of you guys? A few of you, maybe? You guys should be able to party it up. Oh, let's see. Definitely a different spin to the nights. Not used to kind of having semi-prepared material and then throw in a little heavy metal tune in the middle of it. We'll see what that does for the old algos tonight. But if you you get the opportunity, by the way, don't forget to stop in tomorrow. We'll be kicked off at 9:30 a.m. Eastern. That seems to be the landing spot I've made work so far. Kick things off, get the old stream up, and I've already got a few things already set aside from the weekend here for some financials in the morning, if you want to check those out. Tomorrow may actually be a 3 break-in day. I do morning, and I got a couple things that I do want to cover maybe midday. I did come across an interesting post from Edward Snowden on some financial stuff. It's a bit of a long read, so I don't want to spend all morning going through all that just because of all the stuff that has come through this weekend, and probably have some stuff in the overnight hours, so I may save that for middle part of the day, and then we'll close things out at the back end of the day tomorrow as well. And I do apologize, by the way, for Friday. Time kind of got away from me and got sidetracked and ended up just having to shut it down. So try to keep you guys informed if that happens. Throw something in chat. Alright, so you guys are pretty quiet tonight. Apparently it did its work, aside from the old violin screaming there for a bit. Fire has managed to put you guys all to sleep, and apparently your hot cocoa and coffee and that done its job. Oh, it wasn't my heavy metal, Sheila. That was just part of the article. I just found it interesting that you got a little old lady who's you know, lived in the Holocaust times and that found a way and an avenue to put her expressions out there. And you know, obviously this before all the pandemic business hit, and as the article alludes to, you know, being in New York and what we witnessed play out last year as part of that, it's extremely troubling. And hopefully there will be justice, true justice, not just us, but justice that will be served. Criminal. Yeah, I don't play heavy metal. No, it's, yeah, not necessarily my cup of tea these days. Maybe in a former day. Alright, well, that being said, I think I'll go ahead and power down here this evening. Appreciate you guys tuning in as always. And if things go well, like I said, kick this thing off 9:30 a.m. Eastern tomorrow. Get the stream up. Got a lot of stuff to go over financially and all sorts of stuff that's come through the old feed here this past weekend. So kick it off then. Probably do a midday. Close things out tomorrow afternoon, and we'll see you guys then. Take care. God bless everybody.